Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to look at something that was so confusing I recorded a whole half-an-hour video and then decided I didn't even understand it. What we're going to talk about in this video is the link between the current account deficit, the CAD, and the economic issue of external stability. It's pretty complex on the face of it, but I think we can make it a bit more simple so you can explain it in short answers and essays and maybe the occasional multi that really tries to trick you. So if you're unfamiliar with external stability, I suggest you start with the what is external stability video, and you can get the link just by clicking up the top there. And once you've done that and you've had a look at the components of external stability, you can join us for this issue of how does the CAD affect external stability. Okay, play the intro. So, as discussed, we're talking about how does the CAD affect external stability. Another way that you could think about it is this idea of what is the effect of a continued CAD on the Australian economy. Let's just focus on that for a moment. If we're talking about this idea of a continued current account deficit, that with the idea of a continued current account deficit, what we mean is if something is continued, it persists, right? It's not just a one-off and then it disappears into the universe. It persists, it continues. So why are we even asking this question? And remember, we're asking this question in the context of the Australian economy. And the reason we're asking this question is because of this graph here. Now, depending on when you're viewing this, this could be hopelessly out of date, but it gives you a useful bit of historical perspective. Comes from the very good people at tradingeconomics.com, link in the description. So the reason that I've included this graph is for this reason. So what I've done is I've done this green line with a purple star highlighting 0. And what this 0 means is that, this means that Australia's, that's an apostrophe here, Australia's current account deficit is equal to 0% of GDP, because this graph is Australia's CAD as a percentage of GDP. Now, can you see, going back to, at least for the purposes of this graph, from the late 90s, even goes back further, but the late 90s, all the way through when I'm recording this video in 2019, can you see that the CAD has always existed? That Australia has always had a balance on the current account that has been negative. In fact, it's gone towards, let's say, going towards about 8% of GDP and been as low as around 1.5% of GDP. So that what we're trying to say here, if we go to this section here, is that if we're trying to rearrange the following words into a useful sentence that explains this graph, what we would be talking about is this. That Australia has a persistent CAD. This is the thinking, right? That Australia has a persistent CAD. And remember, we saw that. I didn't just tell you that. We saw the graph of that in that little bit from just before. So what that means, if we think about this term persistent CAD, your teacher might talk about it, or I don't know, you might have friends that are always going on about the persistent CAD and you're like, I know, stop talking about it. Or you're like, what do you even mean? That what it means is that Australia experiences ongoing outflows, right? Ongoing outflows. And we talk about outflows, what we're talking about are debits, experiences ongoing outflows that actually exceed inflows, right? And remember that those inflows, they're not debits. These guys they're credits. So that when we have a current account deficit, that Australia experiences ongoing outflows that exceed inflows on the balance of payments. Now, where we start to think about things is this idea here, is that one view, and we'll just put a little 1 here, one view is that a CAD is a negative for external stability. It's a bad thing for external stability. And the questions we ask is the CAD sustainable? Can that debt actually be repaid to other countries, or will this create other economic problems? Do we as a government have to reduce spending in other areas just to repay debt? That's what I mean by other economic problems. Do we have to cut down on education or health spending because the CAD is out of control? So that's number one. But remember, why would you remember? The other view is that actually the CAD could be a positive development. And this is about the Pitchford thesis, the consenting adults thesis, the something doctrine in the UK. I've got it later on. That's a totally different perspective. But the idea is we've got two views on the CAD and external stability. One, it's terrible. Two, it could actually be all right. Let's have a look at those in turn. So our first perspective here, let's get out, green's always a nice choice. Our first perspective, and remember talking about external stability in the CAD, is that Australia's CAD can worsen Australia's external stability. That's our first perspective. And then you might be like, yeah, all right, but what do you even mean? So what we're talking about here is that Australia's CAD can lock Australia into a debt cycle or debt trap. Same thing, just two different ways of expressing it. And what I mean is that we're looking over here. So let's say step one for Australia, rather than having an increasing CAD, Australia has a persistent current account deficit. That means that Australia needs to fund those greater outflows. So Australia needs more capital inflows. And this could be in the form of foreign debt or foreign equity, right? It needs to bring in that extra money to fund those greater outflows. But as we know, inflows create outflows on the balance of payments, and we're going to get high interest servicing costs on foreign debt, plus higher equity servicing costs, so in the form of profits and dividends. So those outflows are going to increase the NPY deficit, which is going to lead to an even more enduring current account deficit. So the idea is that the fact we start with a CAD can keep or cause the CAD to persist. So if we're looking at it even more specifically, what we say is that Australia's CAD can worsen external stability in two particular ways. One is in terms of trade, the other is to do with the savings investment gap. So let's set it up first in terms of trade. What we're talking about here is that let's say that we've got a situation where let's say that in Australia's position, let's say there's a decrease in exports relative to imports. And this happens all the time for Australia for various reasons. We know that Australia's exports fall when global growth falls, that there's fluctuating demand for commodities. This can happen for all sorts of reasons. Now, if exports fall relative to imports, that we're going to worsen the BOGs, the balance on goods and services. So either we create a BOGs deficit, worsen a BOGs deficit. Those situations could occur. If that happens, there will be an increase in the current account deficit, which might start, but actually for Australia would worsen the debt trap or debt cycle that we've witnessed before. So when BOGs worsens, the CAD worsens, need for more capital inflows, start that cycle again. So that's one way that a CAD can be created and then worsen external stability. Let's look at the other way, which is to do with the savings investment gap. So if we look at this idea of the savings investment gap, remember that Australia's levels of domestic saving are less than its desired level of investment, and this happens on a consistent basis. So let's say that savings rates in Australia decline. There will be an increased need for capital inflows in order to fund Australia's desired investment. So what happens is that when Australia attracts greater capital inflow, that's going to lead to greater NPY outflows, and that the CAD will increase, and there we go, back into that debt trap or debt cycle. So what I'm saying in this part is that Australia's CAD can worsen external stability, and that situation can start through these two ways. It can start through a trade deficit, or it could start by a worsening of the savings investment gap. Okay, so our other perspective is that, and let's blue's a good color. Our second perspective here is that Australia's CAD is actually a positive development. It's a good thing for the economy. And when we're talking about this, what we're talking about are the ideas of the Pitchford thesis, right? OneNote doesn't like this, but it's actually really someone's name. John Pitchford, an Australian economist. This thesis, or this idea, is also known as the consenting adults thesis. Some people might be like, what does consenting adults mean? I essentially ask you, please don't Google this. You will be a bit shocked that it's used in an economic context. For our purposes, what we're saying here is basically, what it's saying here is that the private sector in this analogy or in this idea are considered adults in an economy. And adults know what they're doing, right? And we're going to explain this point, but that's what we mean by consenting adults thesis. I've also seen online that they call this the Lawson doctrine in the UK, in case you're watching from the UK. And hello to my UK viewers. If you are out there, please say hi in the comments. Okay, so let's break this idea down. Remember, this idea is that the CAD is a positive development. So the idea here is that CAD, foreign liabilities, so we're talking here foreign debt, foreign equity, they come mainly from the private sector. So it's not a problem that is created by the government. And the theory here, or the thesis, is based on the idea that the private sector uses these funds, this capital inflow, to create productive investment in the economy, right? So it's actually going to increase economic growth. And that the reason we're okay with this is because we think that the private sector calculates the costs and benefits, it evaluates the risks so it doesn't lose money, so it doesn't irritate shareholders, and they do all of this before they start investing. They think about the process. So here, that it comes back to that consenting adults idea that adults know what they're doing, right? And that's what I've written here. So let's highlight this. Let's get a bit of green here. In short, they know what they're doing. And when I say they, I mean the private sector. And this comes back to this idea, my highlighting skills are real off today as well, that they are consenting adults, right? So the idea here is that because of all of these situations, as a result, that the government doesn't really need to worry about the size of the CAD because the private sector is taking care of it. Now, I didn't make this up. What I've included here is an excerpt from an RBA discussion paper, and I'll just move across. RBA discussion paper, and I'll put the link in the description. And the excerpt here said, it is now widely argued that the current account balance need not and cannot be an objective for macroeconomic policies. That the current account balance is not something that the government sets out to try and change in its economic objectives. The RBA continues, nor is it seen by itself as a reliable whoa, as a reliable indicator of vulnerabilities, that the size of the CAD is not a good measure of external stability. That's what these economists at the RBA are arguing. So instead, that it's positive because it allows the private sector to increase investment. And it's not really a worry for the government. It's not a good indicator of whether Australia has improved or worsened its external stability. But I just want you to be aware that there are some contrary views about that. Some people argue that, well, always, the private sector doesn't really get it right in every situation. So that we're looking here at this idea of a contrary view where the private sector doesn't always know what it's doing. And that we can think here, this is an article from CNN looking back at the 2008 global financial crisis or global recession or global downturn, however you want to talk about it, where investment banks like Lehman Brothers got into a lot of trouble in terms of their decisions. So I just want you to be aware when you're talking about the Pitchford thesis that it's not a given or a guarantee that the private sector will always do the right thing. That actually we've seen situations around the world where the private sector does get it wrong. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. That if we're trying to summarize the ideas of this video, that what we're talking about is, yes, Australia has a persistent CAD, but there are two ideas about whether this will make external stability worse or it's not really a problem. For those pessimists among us, that actually the CAD is a negative because it will create larger current account deficits. That's that debt trap or debt cycle idea. The other idea is no, the CAD is a positive because it's allowing the private sector to get money for really good investment and the private sector knows what it's doing. Okay, a lot to take in. Any questions in the comments? And thanks a lot for spending time with me in this video.